Welcome back to Pop Goes the 60s. I'm Matt Williamson. I have a very special guest today, Erika White, podcaster and writer. Welcome, Erika.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, I wanted to talk a little bit. We're going to talk about the Beatles in 1966 and all the problems. But first, I want you to introduce yourself to my audience. I'm sure many of them know you. You do a very good podcast. Start with that.
Sure. Since 2018, I've had a podcast with my co-host Allison Boron called Because the Beatles or BC The Beatles. We were one of the first women-led Beatles podcasts out there way back in the day, but that was almost a decade ago now. So there's lots of others now, filling that space. But we like to talk about the Beatles from both an academic and a super fan perspective. This year, we are focusing on 1966 because it's such an amazing transformational year.
And 60 years on, it's still fascinating.
Hmm.
And this is 66 is the year the Beatles, well, everything kind of hit the fan this year for the Beatles. And I guess they wanted the Beatlemania image to be over, and it certainly was around this time. So we're going to talk about that today. So you had once said that you called the Beatles in 1966 peak Beatles. And what did you
Hmm.
mean by that?
I think they're at this perfect middle point in their career where they've got just enough of everything that makes the Beatles who they are. They still retain some of that Fab Four mop top quality, but they're still experimental. They have gotten into, experimenting intellectually and with drugs and musically, but not to the Wild Honey Pie or Revolution Number Nine sort of sense. It's still accessible while experimental. And I think that the fact that in 1966 they are going through such a transition and their superpower really is to synthesize what they absorb and put it into their music, that they're just it's a merging of everything and it's kind of this, Goldilocks just right moment for them, at least for me.
Yeah, I agree. And they started the year with 3 months off, which is very unusual. Probably the first time they ever had that. So
Definitely.
they started to kind of, I guess, relax. George got married. John was at home pretty much. Paul was the avant-garde Beatle, man about town in London, helping get the Indica Gallery get off the ground.
Hmm.
And but then things, as they resumed their Beatle lives, things really went sideways. And I guess what is your understanding about them, especially coming into America, wanting to change that image and wanting to, I know it was bothering them, but they had to kind of wear
Yeah.
two faces.
Hmm. I think that the image was always something that was manufactured, obviously, to a certain extent. I mean, if you look at John and Paul from as way back as 1957 when they met each other, they had this sort of this yin and yang, this push and pull that sort of made this partnership what it was. But they wouldn't have been acceptable to the world. Brian Epstein, changed that. He put them into suits. He made them polite. He, you know, guarded them from the scandals that may have been happening in their lives. He got them through that door. But he and the Beatles had no idea that they would become the biggest act to ever hit pop culture. They had no idea how deeply those personas would be imprinted on them as human beings. I think especially with A Hard Day's Night, that just kind of solidified those
Hmm.
personas as real in people's minds. And that was them, but it wasn't all of them. And I think the more that they were required to perform as the Beatles, the less of themselves they were allowed to be. They barely got a moment of rest. Any plane ride, train ride, they had reporters, they had people like Murray the K trailing them incessantly in the States, wherever they went. And they were kind of chafing at that, especially John. I mean, even from the very beginning, he had said something like, my little rebellion was to go out with my tie just a little loosened, so it wasn't quite Fab Four, no matter where he went. And then they had 3 months off. They had 3 months off to take stock, to rest for a moment, to go off in these four different directions of who they actually were, not this four-headed monster that was invading the world. And so they were becoming more attuned to, I think, who they were. Yet at the same time, the world hadn't quite caught up with that yet. I mean, the 65 tour, oh, their hair was a little bit longer, but they were still, as late as December 1965, they were doing, small-ish tours of the UK, even after coming back from Shea Stadium. They're still doing very standard pop act sort of bills. And then they had these 3 months, and while they were quiet, the Beatles press machine would have rolled on. They would have been seeing still these images of them from 1964. They'd be on, the flip your wig game and bubblegum cards and all these things. And so I think they were growing up very fast. And by the end of their quiet hiatus, they'd grown up, but the world didn't know. Nobody's caught up to them yet there.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. The world expected the mop tops probably to go on forever, and it
Hmm.
seemed like 66 was set up for that to happen. They were going to do a film that got thrown out. They had the tour set up. You got some world tours, you got the American tour. And I think that the touring kept them away from, like you said, they became themselves. And I always thought that the touring maybe interfered with them really competing with some of the best acts that were out there in 66 because this wasn't happening in a vacuum. Everybody else was starting to up their game as well. So the
Hmm.
Beatles were probably anxious to get back to the studio to record for One Rubber Soul. And now they're going to have to do the whole thing again.
Oh, for sure. And I think they were feeling a bit of pressure with the advent of the Stones and other kind of harder, rougher, more authentic sort of groups that I think might have reminded them of who they were back in Hamburg, back before they became the Fab Four. And I think they didn't like that so much. They felt a little uncomfortable at those kind of comparisons.
Yeah, they may have felt a little too clean or something. Up against the
Definitely.
Kinks and the Animals and the Stones were much more bluesy
Hmm.
and did have a harder sound in many cases, that's for sure. So yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
Well, the first chink in the armor in 1966 really, I mean, as far as the public knew, was the Butcher cover of Yesterday and Today. And you are the expert on that because you've got a book on that coming out very soon.
Mhm.
And that was really quite poorly handled by the Beatles, thinking they could show them their real selves, their avant-garde tendencies to the world, and they would be accepted, I think. What is your feeling about the way they completely really botched it in retrospect, but how they approached it? What was going through their minds?
I don't think they were really looking toward the future when they, especially John. I mean, we'll say this was driven almost entirely by John's desire to break out of this Fab Four image. They, I don't think he was thinking about longevity at all, or even really reputation. He had Now, just to start off, the Butcher cover was not the Beatles' idea. They did not conceive of this shoot. It was conceived of by their house photographer, so to speak, at the time, Robert Whitaker, who came from very surrealist roots. He was always interested in using photographs as art. And he came up with a series of photos that the Butcher cover, along with a number of other photos, were there uh, to showcase the discrepancy between the Beatles as he saw them, which was normal, average, everyday guys, and the deification of the band in popular society. He never meant it to be an album cover or a press photo or anything like that. He was certainly, an avant-garde sensibility, but he also knew what his job was. He knew that he was photographing a pop group. So this was more for his own personal work. Maybe it could have been part of an exhibit in a modern art museum down the line. He had conceived of kind of how he wanted to do it, kind of as a three-panel art piece that called back to the nature of, Russian Orthodox art, that kind of thing. But he wasn't thinking of it as publicity. However, he showed these things to John. When he got the transparencies, he brought them by during a film shoot and during a photo shoot. And throughout the middle months of 1966, the Beatles were coming into contact with these photos, and they were really, especially John, I would say, loving them. And I think that while John and Bob Whitaker had similar core thoughts about why these photos were interesting and why they mattered, the idea of breaking out of the mold of Beatlemania, you know, that was it. That was the statement was it for Bob Whitaker. However, John wanted to disseminate it. And when he knew there was an opportunity, and that opportunity was the latest US Capitol album, one of many that people had already been saying, sliced, diced, and butchered, that, because of the way that they manipulated the UK track list for their own, multi-album catalog. I think John saw the opportunity there. It was a mass-produced item. That I think they sold what 7 times more in volume than the EMI UK albums at the time. However, to them, it wasn't part of their canon because they didn't think of the Capitol albums like that. So it was a great opportunity to just put that thing out there and I think just see what happens. For it wasn't simply for shock value, but it was using the shock value to send a message that I think between the very tight image controlled press machine they had and just the general fandom, he wasn't able to do that on his own, just with his own personality. And what he said, in a few months, he would later find that what he said might help break that mold again, but I don't think that's quite how he wanted to do it.
Good point. And I think that Brian Epstein was a little bit leery of doing this. He hated these photos, and
Hated them.
but he still got talked into it, and possibly because he wanted to placate the Beatles. He was. Some people always connect this with him re-signing the following year with the Beatles, like he was on some kind of probation. I don't know if that's true, if that's what he was thinking. I think they legitimately talked him into it, and he just let them have their way. But what is your thought on that?
Yeah, I think that it might have been a combination of both. We don't have Brian's actual thoughts about this documented anywhere, so we can only speculate. But I think there were two things in his mindset here that can be, we can see in contemporary interviews and what he did say. The first was his unending loyalty to the Beatles. He was if you read Maureen Cleave's profile of him from early 1966, she did all four Beatles and Brian. Now, the John Lennon interview is the one that obviously gets the most traction because of the Jesus comments, but all of them are fascinating. And the one about Brian was so interesting. She said that he's an enigma in almost every way, except this one thing, which is his loyalty to the Beatles is above every single thing in his life. It matters more to him than anything. And I think that was genuine and true. And I also think what you had just said was also very true. His skills were in things that the Beatles weren't needing or wanting anymore. They weren't needing controlled image management. They didn't need somebody to book world tours if they didn't want to go on world tours. And they were moving into the studio and out of that public eye pop star sort of world. And where was Brian's? Where was his place? I think one
Hmm.
thing that he was always very cognizant of was that he did make a big error in business with the merchandising, especially in the States, and how little of a cut they ended up getting. And so my thought is that he probably figured, would he be obsolete? Would they put him out to pasture in a year when it was time to re-sign the contract? What could he do? And they did see people like Alan Klein out there who were rethinking pop stars, how much control they had in their contract negotiations and how much money they got, because the musicians themselves are taking so much more, control and agency in what they were doing that, people like Alan Klein were arguing for that and getting them amazing deals. Could Could Brian do that? I don't know, but I think it was certainly something he was worried about.
Yeah, probably. And I think he knew that was coming. He'd have to do a better job of getting the Beatles a bigger cut because the Beatles were the first, so they typically get whoever gets there first gets the smallest cut. It's all the groups that come after that benefit from that first group, which was the Beatles. So, yeah, their payday hadn't really come in terms of the record deals.
Hmm.
But this album didn't help too much initially because the backlash was rather violent in the States and actually in the UK too. For it was used as a promotional piece for Paperback Writer. So there was really nobody that really said, "Oh, this is really great." It was all you heard was backlash from this cover.
For the most part, I would agree because that's what Capitol heard, and because of that, I think the angry response got an outsized piece of the media. However, if you read letters to the editor in teen magazines in America from the time, you'll actually see a much broader, wider view of the album itself. Everything from that was funny and I loved it to, it's promoting cannibalism, and I think it's satanic. There is a wide range, but a lot of people were like, "Okay, I don't really get it, but
Hmm.
it's no big deal to me." A lot of people didn't really get bothered by it, and some people thought it was quite funny.
Well, I when I was a teenager and I heard about it, I kind of thought, okay, I don't quite get it, but it is interesting. But in the early '80s, by that time, it was that kind of stuff was not edgy like it might have been in 1966. So I can
Right.
appreciate the edginess of it at the time
Hmm.
and the response.
I think the
So,
biggest shock was the shock of seeing the Fab Four doing that. Maybe if the Stones or the Kinks or somebody had some sort of artsy album cover, it would be like, okay, that's weird, but sure. You see, She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, those Beatles smiling as innocent as can be, especially if you look at Paul in that Butcher cover photo. He is happy and innocent with this gore surrounding them. It's
mhm,
so weird.
yeah.
It's weird having no knowledge of who the Beatles were becoming and that they were working with a surrealist artist or anything. It's just weird
Yeah,
and
it is
shocking.
weird. And they're all smiling, basically having a good old time. So had they been
Yeah.
serious, I don't know how that if that would have changed anything, but probably not. But yeah, it is weird. I'll give you that. Well, what happened shortly after was the Bigger Than Jesus issue, which was from the Maureen Cleave interview, which was pre-Butcher cover album. That was in, I think, March of '66 or
Mhm.
thereabouts. And that got published in several places in the United States without any issue, with no comment at all, until a pop magazine, a teen magazine, put it on the cover. And
Yeah.
it was actually the feature, if you're looking, they were trying to kind of start something.
Hmm.
But they weren't using the John Lennon quote to do it. They're using the Paul McCartney quote, and McCartney's on the cover.
Yes. Yes,
McCartney
McCartney.
uses the N word.
He uses
Not
the N word, the
He
full
doesn't
N
use it,
word.
yes, and he doesn't use it to call somebody that. He just uses it as a matter of fact, as a term that's used in the United States, and
Yeah,
that's
he
on
was
the front cover.
disparaging Americans, actually. He was saying,
Correct.
they live in a society where they call Black people this awful name. Like they were saying that this is gross. But, back then, I guess wasn't unprintable in the way it is now. So it was there. It
Yeah,
was
that
right
was a
there.
word. I mean, I heard that word in the '70s in television, not often, but occasionally, but in comedic roles, by
Hmm.
black people typically. Some white people would use it, but it was a term that was probably not that offensive to white people, I mean,
Well,
because
John
that's some
Lennon
people.
himself used it in a song 10 years later.
Exactly. So they tried to get McCartney on that, but the second quote, which is listed under that on the cover of the magazine, was Lennon's quote about the bigger than Jesus. That's what really ended up taking. Why don't you pick it up from there?
Yeah, it was a strange thing, and it wasn't intentional on the part of the magazine. Date Book was actually conceived of as more than just a teen mag. They wanted to talk about the issues that young people in that day were thinking of. So they did always put a little bit of politics, a little bit of, current affairs in there. This particular issue, though, was the controversy issue. So that's why John's quote about Jesus, Paul's quote about Americans, which was also from his Maureen Cleave interview, and a number of other, famous people in pop culture talking about controversial things. I think other topics in that magazine were the war, of course, in Vietnam and interracial dating. So they were really hitting a
Hmm.
lot of the points.
Yeah.
And at first, even in this magazine, it didn't shock. What happened was there were a couple of DJs down in Alabama who were kind of like morning zoo guys, WAQY, I think Wacky Radio, they called it.
Okay.
And these guys heard this and they were kind of looking for ratings. And they did a publicity stunt where they were saying, oh, look at this, John Lennon, we're going to burn the Beatles, we're going to ban the Beatles. And they started it. And perhaps it would have ended there, except a one of the bureau leaders for UPI happened to have been listening that day. He wrote a story about it, and then it started spiraling, and then people started catching on, but with real fervor and real conviction across the U.S. Bible Belt. And very, very soon, people were starting to outdo each other with how much they could ban the Beatles and how crazy they could be about it. Could they, start bonfires and some DJs were saying, "Bring your Beatles albums to us. We'll put them in a wood chipper for you." They were really trying to destroy them. And at first, even the Beatles didn't mind that much. Paul had very famously said, well, you gotta buy them to burn them, so no skin off of us. But then the Klan got involved. Then it got scary, and then that unfortunately happened to coincide with a summer of the butcher cover of their incident in the Philippines, and then their American leg of the tour, which was heading right into the belly of the beast into the South. And that's when they finally had to take it very seriously because their lives were getting legitimately threatened all of a sudden. It was now very bad.
Yeah, going from the Philippines to coming to the States with the Jesus thing, it was like, yeah, it was like they were physically got manhandled in the Philippines. They somewhat, I
Oof.
don't know if I would say salted was the right word, but I don't know exactly. I don't know if they even disclosed exactly what happened, but that was not a good scene. And then coming here to the States to find potentially they could get shot. That was the
Yeah.
you know, kind of things that get stirred up and whipped up by some fanatics. And I think they were starting to get a little nervous. Obviously, John had to make an apology, public
Mhm.
apology on television in Chicago.
Right, but that even came hard for them. Brian tried to solve it himself at first. He came over, he made an apology in front of the press on behalf of the Beatles, but no, they wanted John. They wanted to hear it from him. And so after resisting and saying, I don't even remember saying this and it sounds true to me, like that sounds like something I believe. It's fine. Like I'm not going to apologize for something I'm not sorry about. But eventually they all got scared and he realized he had to do it as a life-saving means if they were going to continue on this tour. They had people in clan suits meeting them at the airport and signs like Jesus died for you, John Lennon, and it was, it's getting scary. So he had to do it. His apology, he seems both nervous and angry and sad and like he's reading from a script like you look at him, he just seems all over the place with it. He knew, I think he had to do it, but this was the exact opposite of what he had hoped for when he was thinking about breaking out of the Beatles image. All of a sudden, he's apologizing for something that he doesn't even think is a thing that needs to be apologized for. And, they are trying to stuff him back into that Beatle box. He cannot get out every time he tries to say something of his own mind, whether it's this or the expression of, something like the Butcher cover. people are like, no, get back into your box. And yeah, that
Yeah.
that kind of did it for him, I think,
Yeah,
with
I think
touring.
that was a turning point for them because the headlines were, "Don't forget what the Beatles have said." You know, it was really one guy that said it, but the
Hmm.
rest of them always had to answer for each other. So that became a problem too because they weren't four individuals. Although they had a lot of group mind where they would say, "Well, we don't know what we think about that." You know, one would answer that as if they were a collective mind. In some
Hmm.
ways, they were, but ultimately, they were individuals, and they had to be allowed to be that. And this was maybe the first sense that the public got of that.
I think it would have been also a very strange moment for them because on one hand they're driving into the airport or flying into the park, wherever they are, and they see on one hand the Klan protesting, on the other, and people counter protesting with signs that said things like Lennon saves. So this is kind of the deification of the Beatles, and John Lennon especially is reaching this fever pitch, and then they go on stage in their matching suits for 20 minutes to a crowd of screaming teenagers, and they're singing their hits. So I think it's a very strange time where, it's George, I think, was first. He was pretty scarred from the touring experience from the beginning, and he was ready to go, I think, before 1966 at all. But I think John and Ringo and even Paul followed suit pretty quickly after that.
Very true. It's amazing they even did this tour. Well, I guess we know why they wanted to quit touring. And this 1966 was the end of it, and I don't see how they could have gone on. But
No, there wouldn't
they
have been
did.
anything to play.
That's true. I mean, the forthcoming album Revolver really made that difficult. How would they have
Mhm.
played Eleanor Rigby on stage? Well, you could do that stuff, but I mean, to screaming fans, it didn't make any sense. And by
No.
66, you have the stadiums were not as full as 65. It was a novelty in 65, had never been done before. Well, those kids could pay $5 to go in 66, but some probably stayed home. I know by Candlestick Park, you had a ballpark that was, they didn't, some say it was half empty. I don't know what the actual sales receipts were, but obviously things were slowing down with Beatlemania.
Hmm.
And too bad the Beatles couldn't have predicted that themselves, but it was decided for them. And
Yeah.
and then Revolver came out, and that was something that people didn't seem to. All this stuff was going on when Revolver came out, and it almost really overshadowed the brilliance of the album.
Hmm.
And it seems that people, they heard the singles, and I don't know how many of those Revolver songs made it onto the radio. I would assume that songs like Tomorrow Never Knows hardly did.
Yeah. I mean, that was never a single, and so they
Hmm.
probably heard the kind of the Revolver adjacent songs, Rain and Paperback Writer and Day Tripper. And, we can work it out.
Hmm.
The ones that were kind of not on the album, and they were possibly on something else in the US, but with the same sort of sensibilities, I think that Revolver had.
Yeah, I do know that the Taxman was kind of a somewhat of a hit. It was kind of popular amongst fans. There was talk about, got back to England about should we release that as another single, which they could have released a second single, but they didn't.
Hmm.
And they just kind of, I guess when the tour was over, they went home and they ended the year with another 3 months off. So basically,
Yeah.
all of this happened within 6 months back,
Hmm.
which was book-eared by 3 months off periods, which is kind of
But yeah,
interesting.
I mean, you got to think like Beetle time is not normal time. Never. The way that they just went through eras and progressed and made trends and then left the trends behind when everybody else was still maybe acclimating themselves to the trends. They were already way ahead doing something completely different. These 6 months were just packed with so much growth and change and development. I mean, to think that by the end of 1965, they had just put out Rubber Soul and were doing these little tours, and by the end of 1966, they were working on Sergeant Pepper. That's an insane leap.
Yeah. And it seems like almost overnight, 66 was that year, the light switch year, where you went from the screaming girls to like what I call like young males that were
Hmm.
dominating the fandom of the Beatles. And I remember one of the quotes from, I forget what magazine it was. One of the girls had commented about the Rubber Soul cover, saying it looks like the Beatles were faces were melting, and it was disturbing to them, you know. And
Yeah.
you know, by the time I saw it in the 70s, I don't know what made me think that it didn't look out of place because I didn't grow up in the 50s and then hit the
Hmm.
Beatles, what you know. But yeah, it was really kind of jarring. I think they started losing fans this year, particularly those girl fans, because then you know you always had Herman's Hermits around, and then of course
Yeah.
the Monkees came late
Hmm.
'66 in September. So I mean, it was kind of that was kind of the handoff, I think, for those fans, for them. The Beatles even didn't even plan
Yeah.
that.
And again, you do see that if you look at the newspapers of the time, the music magazines, you can see the switch in perception of the Beatles from, they're everywhere, pop icons all over the place. And then people are like, are the Beatles losing their touch? Is Beatlemania going away? And people would argue about whether the Beatles were still worth following with all of these new, people, like you said, Herman's Hermits coming out. And I think the younger fans maybe gravitated toward the pop sound that they could still find with new artists, and the older people were maybe growing with the Beatles or growing in a different direction from the Beatles. I mean, just the explosion in music in 67, 68, just the choices that were all of a sudden available, even just on the radio, were outstanding and just so far out of what you would have seen in 63, 64. I think too, we were talking about before about the Butcher cover, whether it was a good choice or not, I think it was an even further miscalculation in America specifically. Because if you think about how the 60s evolves between the UK and the US, in the UK, I think not having the stress of the Vietnam War, I think made it more whimsical in a way, more swinging 60s,
Mm.
still had this very fun atmosphere around it, where I think that how the 60s grew in the States. You think about 67 and then Haight-Ashbury and the protests, and like it was, a tense time, a more serious time. And maybe putting out a photo like that or saying something about religion, those things in America were just hitting differently. I think they just,
Hmm.
people were more serious. People were in the mood to argue about heavier topics, and it made a difference.
Yeah, and the draft was also going on too. So
Yeah.
that was a major that was a difficult time for people in a war that we didn't, it wasn't clear what are we fighting this war for? What's going on? What's right and wrong?
God, how scary
It
that would have
wasn't
been.
like the Civil War or World War One or two, where you can see where the bad guys are clearly, you know, the lines are drawn and they're very separate on either side. So yeah, I think the United States, it was a very volatile time, or just about to be. And this year that 66 kind of got it started. And then it
Yeah.
looked like in 67, well, this Summer of Love, which was kind of a misnomer, or it was true for a
Mm,
little bit before it became a big part of pop culture, which became commercialized completely,
yeah.
which we're still feeling the effects of today. They
Hmm.
still talk about that as some kind of like fairy tale time with the Woodstock Nation and all this. I mean, it's all a lot of, fairy tale storytelling
Hmm. And then I
because
always think of George Harrison when he visited Haight-Ashbury and how much
yeah,
he hated being there. And you wouldn't think
yeah.
that thinking about the fantasy fairy tale Summer of Love. You'd think that the Beatles would fit right in, but it is much grittier and harsher, I think, than
Yeah, it was
you think.
that the 60s took on an image like the Beatles had their image. The 60s had its own image as well, and it wasn't quite true.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that was part of that, I think, going on simultaneously. These things clash, these images clash, and so yeah, it was very strange times, and I didn't grow up in those times, but I certainly have had enough time to study it and reflect on it and listen to all the
Me
music that was
too.
made during that time, and some of the best music ever made, which is why I have this channel, actually.
Yes. Yes.
So yeah, so it's a fascinating period, and Revolver, I think, really, I think, got them. They don't talk, they never talked a lot about that album, but because it was recorded rather quickly, mostly
Yeah.
before the tour.
It's recorded in two
So,
months, really, April and May of 66. And then they went immediately on tour.
and somebody had said that the first three songs that they recorded, those are the ones got used for Yesterday and Today, but that can't be true because I think Tomorrow Never Knows was the first song recorded, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. It was the first three songs that they had in the can, really.
Okay.
So Tomorrow Never Knows probably took a lot more engineering work than I'm Only Sleeping or, the ones that they did have ready for them.
Can you imagine if that song was done in those first three and that got put on to Yesterday and Today? Can you imagine?
Maybe that the meat cover wouldn't have been quite as big of a deal.
Yeah, maybe it would have made more sense. I don't
Yeah.
know. Surrender to the Void. I don't know.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, the touring that the Beatles ended in 66, I think they kind of had decided at the end. I mean, they kind of knew this was the end of the line. And I think they just knew they were going to get some time off and then get back in the studio. So I don't think they
Mhm.
thought much more of it than that. Although George's famous quote, he said that I'm not a Beatle anymore, which I
Yeah.
thought
I
was
mean,
always interesting.
I think they knew by that point. I think so, you see this transition throughout 66 where in the very beginning of 1966, Brian says something to the press like, I see 1966 being very much like 1965 with touring an album and a new film coming out. I mean, that prediction couldn't have been more wrong, really, because it just kind of spiraled out of his control. And I think that touring is a great model for what, it's just a microcosm of what you're seeing with the Beatles in 66. Brian Epstein's trying to keep it all together and he's scheduling these massive tours, trying to top Shea Stadium, trying to top what they did in 1965. Could they have ever done that? I don't know. That might have been the limits of what maybe you could or should do in a stadium as a rock concert at the time, and where do you go from there? And he knew too that the Beatles were dissatisfied with it. They were done, they were tired of it. I think things like people bringing sick or disabled children to them
Hmm.
backstage was really upsetting to them, especially John. Like they were starting to get very uncomfortable with the idea of the deification, and I think I think that the tour, in a lot of ways, was Brian's attempt to get them back into enjoying that sort of life. The first three places that they went, the Philippines, West Germany, back to Hamburg and to Japan, they were meant to entice the Beatles, to make them excited for touring.
Hmm.
Never before been to two of those places, and Germany would be like a victory lap for them after their stints in Hamburg, and even that couldn't really do it for them. They were there, but they were uncomfortable with it. Even the press conferences in Hamburg in Germany, they were getting very combative, where one reporter said, "Why are you so horrid snobby to us?" And they started fighting with them on in a press conference, which was very unusual. That's new. And then I think they also realized how how much they had strayed from their musicianship because they got to hear themselves play for the first time in Japan because the culture there, people were being taken out if they were being loud, and they'd emptied out parts of the seats so that they were surrounded by this, risen up stage and emptiness all around. So it was probably this cavernous sound to them. And for the first time in a long time, they heard themselves play, and they were really disappointed with what they were hearing. Their harmonies were off. They were forgetting the words. Their energy was low. Their set list was a little bit weird. Like everything about it was
Hmm.
was disconcerting in a way.
Yeah, you had mentioned that they kind of struggled with songs to play live. I mean, they had electric version of Yesterday. They did
Mm,
Babies in Black, which was an odd song to play at a rock concert.
so
And
weird.
yeah, they seem to either not care or, I mean, how hard is it to fill 30 minutes? But
Well,
they,
yeah, I think that's kind of the struggle though, right? Like, do we play She Loves You? Do we play those songs from 2 years ago? Can we mentally go back to that place in our lives and do it?
mhm,
And you see that they don't play that. If they play anything from the old days, they play rock and roll music. They play something that is authentic to them, to their roots, you know? They don't
mhm,
play Beatlemania songs. And then they have to pick from what they've got, more and more. Their songs are not impossible yet to replicate live, but not the same, double tracking and studio
yep,
effects. They were still using them. So the songs were a little bit odd. And then songs like Yesterday, which was a pioneering event to use a string quartet in a pop song, and it was just Paul. But it was it was such a hit. They played it, but they had to reorchestrate it for a four-piece band. So they made this arrangement of it, and you can hear these concerts they're all over YouTube, and it's very weird. It's one of I find it uncomfortable in a way because it's taking that song and putting it into this more classic early Beatles formula. And while it sounds like early Beatles, all of a sudden, it shouldn't. And it's just weird. I don't know.
yeah. I
It
wish
annoys
they would
me.
have done something. I mean, they could have added harmonies to it. So they're doing three-part harmonies on Nowhere Man, If I Needed Someone, and Paperback Writer on tour. They could have tried harder with Yesterday to make it into something that would have worked live. And
Yeah.
there's many different ways you could take that arrangement, and they didn't really take it anywhere. I remember seeing the film footage of Ringo playing the drums just with this like the most bored look on his
Oh
face
no.
playing that song.
It's just,
It
yeah.
was really, it's almost comical.
Or
And
just not played it. I mean, it
yeah,
was even in the UK, they refused to put it out as a single because they didn't think it represented themselves as a
mhm.
band. But in the States, they did put it out as a single the day after it came on the Ed Sullivan Show live, and it was this huge, huge hit in, late 65. And then they built this whole album Yesterday and Today around that song. And so maybe they felt that they had to play it, at least for America, but maybe they didn't. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it was such a big hit that they think they had to play it. And then
Mm.
Nowhere Man was the single that preceded the tour. And then Paperback Writer. It would have been cool if they did Rain. That would have been really cool.
Yeah,
But
I
didn't
don't.
do
Yeah,
that
how
one.
would they have
I
done
mean,
it?
well, I mean, they could have done it. It's just two guitars, bass, and drums.
Yeah,
That's
just
all
no
you
no
need.
backwards effects.
No backwards
It would
effects.
just lose a little, but
Yeah.
in that set list though, you mentioned before, the biggest outlier is Babies in Black. What they
Yeah.
were thinking to put a dirge waltz about a woman who is grieving a boyfriend. Why would you put that in a rock concert of any kind?
I
It's
don't
so
know.
weird.
And to do it in 66 too, when that came out in 64. I mean, you
Yeah,
might as well just play A Hard Day's Night
I know. I think
or I Feel Fine.
they must have felt that it represented more of their later themselves, but play
Maybe.
No Reply, play, something
Yeah,
else.
yeah. Well, 30 minutes is too bad they didn't at least have an hour. But I mean, you couldn't hear it much anyway. And it was,
Right.
just early times. So it's hard to be too
Yeah.
critical of them because nobody knew. And, they're just trying to get through the
No,
day,
but
I
yeah,
suppose.
nobody knew. But I think over time it wore on them. George especially, I think he just, what is the point of doing this? We're getting screamed at and no one can hear us anyway. And I
Yeah,
think that
very
really
true.
bothered him. He wanted to be a musician and you could no longer be one if nobody cared what you were playing.
Very true. And yeah, they weren't playing, and I can't imagine all these other musicians would come to see them during this time, and it would be strange to me for the Beatles to meet them after the concert, after just doing some kind of Babies in Black or whatever
Yeah.
kind of Beatlemania era songs, and they have to meet like a Jimi Hendrix or somebody, that it's like things were changing so quickly.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because sometimes you think of the Beatles as the trendsetters, the culture setters, but
Mhm.
really at this point, I think they were running to catch up in a way. They were. those 3 months of quiet sort of got
Hmm.
them more in touch with what was happening around them in the avant-garde worlds and art and literature and music. And now they were still in this, early Beatles mold. They had to break out. They needed to
Yeah.
do something.
In November '66 in Britain, the Beach Boys were rated the number one band. They had Good Vibrations out, and the Beach Boys were ahead of the Beatles at that point with that single. That's how strong of a single that was, how
Yeah.
groundbreaking. So yeah, they had some catching up, a little bit of catching up to do.
Yeah, and it's interesting because right after that tour, John went off to film How I Won the War. Um, which was an unusual project. I think the first solo project that any of them had undertaken, and it was an acting role. It was very weird, but he wanted a break. He just wanted to not be in the Beatles for a bit. And when he returned from filming that show with his haircut and his short hair and his, NHS issued round granny glasses, you could just see that nothing would ever be what it was in the early part of the year again.
It's strange though, but the following year when they weren't touring, Lennon was quoted as saying, because he wanted to be with the Beatles more, because maybe that touring thing wasn't there and
Mm.
needed the camaraderie. This is things that his wife Cynthia had talked about. They were going to go off somewhere, and she said, "John, are we going to take a trip by ourselves?" He's like, "Don't you want our Beatle buddies to come with us?" So it's kind of funny how they were joined at the hip in many ways, but they did need a break from each other. For
Yeah, and just from the mania and from the fans who wanted to consume them and know of everything, every move that they made was probably a strain
Mhm. Well,
on that relationship.
the 3 month break they took at the beginning of the year, at the end of the year, that seems to be the good remedy. Maybe they should have done that after the White Album, in between that and the Get Back thing, instead of doing like 6 weeks or whatever it was. Take the full three
Yeah.
months, you
Hmm.
know, decompress a little bit, then get back together.
Yeah. And I do wonder had, Brian lived and they stayed working with him, I've always wondered if he would have kept those kind of pieces of order in place in a way that would have made things last a bit longer or not just be as contentious at the end.
Yeah, I think that would have certainly happened because the Beatles clearly could not manage themselves, and they were not managers. They were Beatles, as they would say, once they realized that they were
Yeah.
failures as record head to A&R
Yeah.
men and that type of thing. So yeah, I do believe that had Brian stayed on, and Apple was already in the works before he died, he would have been running that, and that would have been a full-time job, obviously. So I
Hmm.
think that there would have been, you would have had somebody to bounce something off of. Magical Mystery Tour never would have came out in the fashion it did. It may have
No.
come out, but in a different way. Brian would have seen to the proper people to handle certain things, so the Beatles didn't have to do that. Because once they stepped out of music, especially when they went into the film part themselves,
Mm.
they didn't do too well.
No, they did not. They
I mean,
did
they
not.
still
They
had
did
some
not.
wonderful things came of it, but it was not their cup of tea. They were
No, they
musicians.
needed that person to give them that structure, and without it, even if you look at the whole, Get Back long film, it was hours and hours of them being like, "What are we doing here? Why are we here? What is this for?" There was nobody to give them that structure, and they found it themselves. And Paul ended up stepping up in his way, I think, as much as he could with the limited amount of, managerial experience he had. But they didn't know. They didn't know. They didn't have that bigger picture view of what the Beatles should be as an entity.
Yeah, I could imagine, let's say the Beatles wanted to do the Get Back, Let It Be project, and Brian is saying no, no, just like the Butcher cover. And then he relents. But then at least there's kind of Brian always would take care of them. The four Beatles could always blame it on Brian. I mean, that
Yeah.
would have kept them together instead of them trying, the managerial part of it pulled them apart, really.
And who knows, maybe Brian would have loved the idea that Michael Lindsay Hogg had of this grand trip to, Tripoli and doing it in
Yeah,
like the ruins
that
of
might
a,
have happened if Brian
yeah.
was involved because more time would have been taken and Ringo could have done his acting with Peter Sellers and then maybe done stuff after or whatever, would have been done in a more, business-like manner, I guess.
Yeah, well, the timing itself of that project was what drove it, but was also kind of what made it so chaotic.
Yeah, and it's kind of we got some really good stuff. I mean,
Hmm.
I think it's amazing what they came up with. But I mean, they could only pull the magic trick so many times, and there were very few rabbits left in the hat when they got done with the
Hmm.
Let It Be stuff. So,
Yeah,
but
I
they
think
did.
they were pretty well sick of each other by then too.
Yeah, they needed a break.
Yeah.
Well, we're already in 1969 here, so
Amazing.
yeah. So I mean, the topic that never gets old. Well, that's a good place to stop. So let me just reintroduce you to the crowd here. You've got
Yeah,
podcast because the Beatles, BC The Beatles. I'll put that link below. You
great.
have a book coming out very soon, sooner than later, we hope, about the Beatles Butcher cover. And that
Yes,
is something that is I'm really fascinated about. And I'm looking very much forward to seeing that. So we're going to have you back when that is close to coming out to talk about that book specifically, because it's a really nice package, folks.
excellent. I think it's a fascinating story. It's so much more than what you hear in the Beatles. You know, most Beatles biographies give it a footnote, if that. And it really is an involved and exciting story. And I'll be doing some readings of excerpts of it later on this year, and it will be coming out in the spring
Very
now.
good. Well, we are looking forward to that. I'm sure many of my viewers are chomping at the bit to get it. So we'll
Great.
have you back and remind them. So,
Definitely.
all right. Well,
And that'll
thanks.
be a great time. We'll do it in the anniversary of the photo shoot that brought about the butcher cover in March. We're gonna do something like that.
There you go. That works for me. All right. Well,
Great.
thanks so much for joining me. And everybody, we will be back with another interview here on Pop Goes the 60s.